The Quarantine Sessions podcast with J. Cole.
Hello. Hi. How's it going, man?
So dark. It's going good, brother. It looks super dark. What's going on there?
It's appropriate for your Dark Wizard, persona.
Totally.
I expected you to be in like some kind of obsidian palace or, like a obsidian spire or a tower, perhaps.
I gotta up level. I gotta get one of those.
Yeah, dude, you're all about like the success and wealth manifestation. Like you don't even have an obsidian tower, and you call yourself a Dark Wizard.
It's definitely the next piece. I wonder what an obsidian tower is worth in Byron Shire these days.
It's probably not a lot. Probably not a lot of obsidian towers to be found. But you could be that guy. Like, I know Dane. He's the guy that lives in the obsidian tower.
That thing up there that we're all terrified of. I heard it's great.
Yeah. How do I sound? There's like people doing some maintenance on the rice paddies back here, but hopefully you can't hear it too badly.
No, I just heard it's very gently when you pointed that out, but you sound pretty loud and clear.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and when I edit this, I guess I'll like do some noise reduction and stuff like that, and hopefully it shouldn't be
cool.
that big of a deal.
Awesome.
Was there anything kind of particular you wanted to talk about today? Anything that's really burning that you wanted to steer the direction of the conversation towards?
I'm feeling pretty open, man. Like, the whole magic thing, it's a cool timing because that's becoming much more at the forefront of what I'm leaning into and talking about. But I don't have any strong agendas to like, I'm not really peddling anything right now, but I'm definitely very interested in those tracks, and they're becoming much more full time, I guess, so that
awesome.
anything on that sort of stuff.
Cool. I'd love to nerd out about magic with you. Well, if you're ready, we can jump right in.
Good to go, bro.
Cool. So thanks for coming on, Dane. It's awesome to talk to you. I love what you do with your Dark Wizard media and all the content that you put out. It's a very kind of like grounded and a kind of iconoclastic view of spirituality, which I really resonate with.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah. I guess I wanted to start the conversation off by asking you what it means to you to be a Dark Wizard and why you choose that. We briefed before the recording began that you don't actually live in an obsidian tower, which I was a little bit disappointed to hear. But I know you're working on it, so I forgive you for that. But still curious about the title Dark Wizard and what that means to you.
It's a big letdown, the lack of obsidian towers. It happens a lot, but the Dark Wizard thing, it's a nickname that I got given by a friend and mentor, Janine Marie, who's inside the kind of ISTA, International School of Temple Arts world. And, the kind of cosmology we're all playing with and agreed on, there's this idea of the integration of the dark and the light and the masculine and the feminine, and I guess a lot of the popular spirituality that seems to run the show, whether it's kind of Bali or California or here in Byron Bay in Australia, it's very light, it's very ascension towards the realms and the 60 or the 13D or the 500D or whatever, and the angels and the dolphins
so many
and
Ds.
whatnot. Yeah, so many. You just got to keep one-upping each other with the Ds, and that's all well and good, that's all cool. The ascension-based spiritual philosophies they're cool, but really to me the dark is about density and groundedness and integration into the material realm. And I've had a long journey with various teachings and teachers and whatnot, but it was always the things that took into account the here and now, and that honored the denser realities that I was attracted to, you know, and the polarization against that seemed to be woven into everything from Christianity to New Age spirituality. You know, there's a lot of denial of the material, and that's not really my gig, you know. So the whole Dark Wizard, it's not so much about, you know, and I think it's funny with the word dark, because it's easy to project your unconscious content onto anything that is dark or called dark. And I think that's, a lot of people have a difficult journey with their disowned parts, like, well, that's dark. And it's like, well, what's wrong with dark, you know? So yeah, to me, kind of dark implies density, implies groundedness. And it's funny in a way, because I'm not only, like, I am interested in, work with, and love the whole spectrum of light and dark, but somehow people who are wanting to play in the dark seem rarer at the current time. So it's almost more like, it's almost more about integration for me, and willingness to play in the sides that are less honored and less kind of explored, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. I think both you and I tend to play a bit of the role of the iconoclast within spiritual culture, because we both live in these places. You're in Byron Bay, I'm in Ubud. They're very similar culturally, which is a lot of this, like, oh, it's all ecstatic dance, and it's all like a lot of kind of culturally appropriated forms of spirituality from, you know, like South America or Eastern religions and things like that, with that are taken out of context without really understanding them fully and deeply. But just in general, the emphasis on things that are all about kind of like the color spectrum of, the light, joy, and ecstasy and stuff like that, which is fantastic. But you can't really arrive at true joy until you've really honored all the different flavors of emotionality that arise within human incarnation, you know. And I do think that there is like an urgency to be that guy who's willing to hold that polarity, you know, and to show it as a mirror to people so that they don't kind of overlook it. You know, it's that the whole error of spiritual materialism, which is at an all-time high really right now. But you know, the idea that you can use spirituality to get away from reality rather than to just really look at reality for what it is, which is in a lot of cases the true intention of spiritual practice.
I love that. And you know, it's funny, this kind of new age journey and this new age kind of white light sort of sheen, because to me, like, a lot of people are picking up new things, but they're still underneath, they're basically running like the Christian model, you know. And it's now we've got rose quartzes and we've got whatever, but you know, but it's still like the bad is out there, you know, and it's not in me, and it's outside. And you know, I've got to do my 47 layers of protection in case the bad energy would come into me or into my house. And it's like, you know, to me it's hilarious, you know. And it's like, and when people begin to integrate a bit of darkness or a bit of whatever they've cast outside, that becomes less and less important to be playing in that sort of like, you know, that world of splitting things off and pushing the thing that is bad over there, rather than dancing with all of it. And it's funny, you know, and I'm lucky, I guess, or that I had an early introduction to new ageness and all that sort of stuff. You know, it was like my kind of early teens. It wasn't like something I clocked in my mid to late 20s or something. It was like I was 13 and 14, and my mum was going through her version of it, you know, the sort of, what would she be, late 40s woman awakening thing. And it was all the Celestine prophecy and lots of ladies who were into dolphins and future readings and mediumship and angels. And so I got a lot of doses of that. I was like, okay. And I got to see the power and the beauty of some of it, and also see the like, oh, I think this woman who's my mum's hanging out with is kind of full of shit. Like, you know, I think she's saying things that are channeled, but it's actually her personality that's saying that, you know. And I got to have that journey real young and be like, okay, right, like, stand it, you know. It's
Yeah, that's good. I think a lot of people get kind of caught in it because it does, there is a process, I suppose, of being exposed to that. Actually, you know, I feel like when I first got exposed to that kind of culture, which I came to it through psychedelic art and stuff like that, I was initially quite kind of like put off by it and just felt like very uncomfortable in those spaces, and just like, I don't think this is who I am, and would like kind of, you know, leave the group meeting slowly, hoping that no one would notice. But there was just something about it that just didn't really resonate with me, and still doesn't. But I've as I've explored it further, I begin to understand why, because a lot of it is, I think, fear that's actually projected out. There's a reflection of needing to protect yourself from something. And
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of wisdom in traditions like in Tibetan Buddhism, or even here in Bali, where they look at what we would consider darkness, or consider the scary aspects of life, to be as sacred and as profound as the light ones. And that it's recognizing all of it as the play of illusion. And the main goal is to extricate yourself from that. So you're not taking sides, you see it all as just a game, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I moved out of home when I was 16, and I moved in with like a kind of, I'm like a metalhead dude who was a lot older than me, you know, he was like late 20s. He seemed like an old dude, grown up at the time, you know. It was like maybe 26 or 27, and I was like, yeah, a young 16-year-old. And he was deep into like Enochian magic and acid and, you know, H.R. Geiger sort of art and stuff that was just really, at first was like, what the fuck, you know? And, you know, had a bunch of friends that had committed suicide, and like, you know, was a bit of, you know, always dressed in black. And we got on, he was a good friend. But I remember it's like, and I didn't come from a Christian family, but I've obviously come from a Christian culture in the broader sense. And I never thought of myself as Christian. Went to a Catholic school for a few years till I got kicked out in my high school kind of phase. But I didn't know that I had like Christian conditioning until I start looking at these, you know, dark, morbid things and imagery of like angels and demons, and like, and it just fucked with my head at first, you know, and then somewhere in there, I think I was at uni not long after, and I started getting into kind of Carl Jung. I was doing comparative religion, and something flipped around like, oh, projection. Oh, the evil isn't in the tarot cards. Like, I don't need to burn these tarot cards because they're evil. There's things in these images that stir things in me that I'm super uncomfortable with, and I don't know what it is. And it just opened this potential that, oh, so like it's stuff that's in me and I'm scared of it. And whether that's an image of some grisly, you know, part rotten earth being mixed with metal, you know, like the Geiger style art, which I used to stare at it, you know, on acid thinking, this is beautiful, this is disgusting. And I really was stretched by it at that time. But I'm really grateful, because I guess that was the beginning of kind of like shadow work, you know. I'm like, oh, is this because I'm uncomfortable with death, actually, that I feel like this? And I remember getting a bit deeper into like, you know, medieval magic and stuff, and the grimoires, and being like, oh, so like the demons are the bad ones and the angels are the good ones. But who said that? Like, who decided these ones are the baddies and these ones are, and it was like this kind of, you know, this distrust of authority that had laid out the structure in the first place. And what got me on this is, you know, and you transition to Eastern cultures, whether it's Tibetan or even in China or in Bali, and there's this kind of like the demons and the whatever are kind of mixed right in. It's not so much so clear cut of good, and it's not a clear cut good and bad. It's kind of more of a mishmash of like, well, we offer offerings to this guy because he scares off the other ones. And it's like, oh, like, that's interesting.
Yeah. Even in the medieval grimoire tradition, it's from a Christian culture. So that it comes with that kind of like, you know, that colors it, right? So there is this idea still of demons being bad. But it's true, in a lot of other cultures in the world, they don't even make a distinction with angels and demons. They're both aspects of the divine. They're both representation of the spirit world. And they're kind of you know, it's like a whole cast of characters that each fill different roles, and for, some are better for certain purposes than others, but they're not seen really necessarily. There's like a humanity in a way to even their representation of spirits, because they don't see them as being strictly bad or strictly good. It's like they are their own unique entities with a lot of different characteristics and things like that that they could interface with. And I think that that kind of nuanced view of the world is a lot more integrated, and it's a lot more effective, you know, because that is the world we live in. It's the case even with people that we might see as being evil, even in the case of people, or like particular cultures or things like that. And it's really easy to succumb to black and white thinking, but it takes more wisdom to see it in that nuanced way.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm thinking of like Bill Gates. Depending on which sort of a, you know, scene you would hang out in, you get a different verdict. It's like, what a great guy doing all that, and like, he's the Antichrist. I'm like, okay, whoa, both of those seem a little, you know, imbalanced, I guess, you know.
And that's projection, right? Like fundamentally. And I think one of the kind of gems of magical thinking and the idea of magic is that like everything is a projection. Like everything is like an illumination of our mind, that kind of hermetic, the hermetic saying that all is the mind and the mind is all, right? So like everything is a projection of the mind, and therefore that is what we're working with as we go about life. It's hard, and it's very few people that ever kind of ascend out of the density of the mind to be able to see things for what they really are. Yeah,
it's a real I guess the inner circle of friends that I now have, you know, it's almost not like this has been mentally applied, but it's almost a cutoff or a requirement that it's got to be people who own their shit. You know, there's like no one amongst my core people that, you know, anyone, we're humans, you know, anyone could have a drama or a problem or a difficulty. Like it's not that, but it's rare that big projection will be left unchecked. They'd be like, hang on, bro, are you really saying that it's all him? You know, and that would come into the conversation at some point. It's like, well, no, I know that he's showing up as a reflection. It's like, okay, cool, we're good, you know. And it's sort of almost like that's one of the reality agreements that I would need to have, like, to trust someone or be friends with someone, or, you know, it's kind of like, okay, just a level of integration. Like, not that we all have to have reached the point where we don't have triggers or anything like that ever, but just that almost like the speed of integration is one of the measures that I, you know, it's one of the things that I respect or don't respect about people. Is like, okay, this person hit a bump in life and they've been able to unpack that and take that on and turn that into something, versus someone who, you know, it could be like a year later and they're still on the same problem or the same story. And it's just like, dude, like, are you really going to just keep pretending that's outside you? Like, you know, you're dating the same kind of woman as last year and the same kind of problems are happening, and it's all her. Like, you know, like, I just feel like that's one of the measures of some degree of spiritual maturity, I guess. And, you know, to me, that first came in through NLP, you know, and like, the hermetic laws and stuff, it's like, oh, this is kind of the same, and these guys had this fleshed out a long time ago. And yeah, it seems to be one of the traits that I notice in people that I find interesting, or that have a decent degree of sovereignty, I suppose.
Yeah, me too. I think it's kind of like people who are willing to face the things that they're afraid of, you know, and a lot of people who kind of have a darker aesthetic. They're not evil, but they tend towards things, they face things that they might be uncomfortable with or they might be afraid of, and integrate them, you know? Yeah. And that level of courage seems to allow for people to have greater efficacy in the world, for one thing, but also just to be more kind of like comfortable within themselves. And I found within aspects of spiritual culture that tend more towards the all love and light, they're a bit squeamish, right? And they're still like uncomfortable with aspects of themselves. They're not fully at home with themselves. They scare easily. you know, and I guess for me, I value that kind of solidity or sovereignty that you mentioned. That seems to come from really deeply diving into and exploring and confronting the ugliest parts of ourselves.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it seems like we're on the same page with that bit of our philosophy.
For sure. I'd love to hear more about your spiral technique. It's something I've gotten information from it from other friends that have done it, but I'd love to hear from you firsthand what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, spiral. There's a lot. I explain it almost different to every person who ever asks me, you know, which is hard for the practitioners because they're like, how do I fucking explain this thing? It's like, well, depends who you're talking to, but really, it's the culmination of a bunch of different tools for essentially integrating unresolved emotional patterns. That's one way to put it. And it really evolved from me doing a lot of kinesiology and a lot of really amateur kind of self-actualization shadow work on myself with various friends from sort of 19 onwards. And, you know, I was into, like, at the time, picking up girls and freestyle rap, you know, that was all I cared about. And so I had a friend who had learned a bit of kinesiology, and I'd be constantly like, okay, I've got this battle coming up and I'm freaking out off this guy and I don't think I can beat him. Because he'd be like, okay, what does he represent to you? And it's like, he represents this. So we would clear and integrate whatever that archetype was. And, or I really like this girl and I can't talk to her. I get nervous. I said, what does she represent? Well, she's kind of like graceful and I'm not graceful. So we'd be clearing statements around whatever it was. And, you know, I noticed that I could integrate things. Like a week later, I'd be dating that girl or winning that competition or whatever. And it was like, fuck, I'm changing super fast. And so between that and the Jungian psych and a little bit of Buddhism and a little bit of this, a little bit of that, I got access to a few tools that helped me really integrate emotional stuff really quickly. And I started to notice that I was developing in whatever area I sort of applied it to. I would go from like terrible to average to good to like, fuck, I have an uncommon level of ease in this area. Like, that's so amazing. And lived with that for a while and did my kind of rap thing and whatever. And eventually I started sort of getting drawn towards the personal development world, did all the kind of coaching courses and NLP and this and that. And eventually went and did a kinesiology training. And I was sort of between these two worlds of one was kind of the body-based healers, and the other was more like the mindset-based coaching world. And I was like, fuck, these guys have got two halves of something awesome, you know, like the kinesiologists had no good questioning skills and very little understanding of mental maps and models, but they had a phenomenal ability to plug into the body and rebalance things and help people shed things like that was like, you know, it could have been a problem for 20 years and it just sheds. Likewise, the NLPers were just so good at belief change, value systems, all that stuff. And I just started mixing the two together and adding other models like the scale of consciousness from David Hawkins. And then I found spiral dynamics and I found chakras. And at a certain point, it was like 20 years of stuff just really started to converge. And this map unfolded. And it was really an ascension-based map of, you know, if you layer the chakras next to spiral dynamics, next to the scale of consciousness, they all seem to be saying the same thing, which is that depending on what level of consciousness you're at, that's how the world looks. You know, that's kind of what I saw was that most of the spiritual systems that offered some way of ascending that ladder were very slow. Like, you know, I love Buddhism, but as a Buddha creation technology, it's highly inefficient, you know, like there's how many Buddhists and there's only been a couple of Buddhas. So it's kind of like, we've got to assume that system is either very, very difficult or not that efficient, or there's a lot of shit in the way, basically, is how I came to look at it. And I started
or it's outdated.
Yeah, or it, you know, it worked.
The conditions of life are different.
Years ago. Yeah. And maybe the levels of baggage and complexity of shit that we have to deal with is just you know, it's too many hours of meditation will be required to blast through that, you know. And I started sort of looking at these healing tools. What if they were applied to really specific layers of the self and were used to kind of unpack conditioning in an orderly fashion, which was the spiral. And I took myself through this journey, and fucking everything changed. It's like I was a different person at each level, you know. I was having like a paradigm shift a week, you know. And so I went through it, and then by the time I'd gone through it, I kind of could see this picture of like, fuck, this is like 7 to 10 years worth of really intensive work with other things. So I started trying to boil it down and package it. And so basically I fused a bunch of modalities into a technique for helping people decondition, but also really moving them from unconsciousness to consciousness, or disempowerment to empowerment, is really what, having now seen like a few thousand people go through it, that's kind of what because at the time I was like, I didn't really know what this thing does, but it does something, you know? And I used to just think of it in the terms of it's about shedding baggage, but I realized it was really about taking out the blocks to people's self-actualization in what seems to be quite an effective way. And I think it's just like the tools all exist, but once they're wrapped into a specific map, then there's kind of like this laser focus of we're ascending someone up that progression. And yeah, so essentially it's what I look at it mostly as is a pathway. You know, it's a pathway to accelerated evolution is kind of how I explain it to the practitioners when they're learning. Yeah.
And it sounds similar in some ways even to ceremonial magic, you know, and like you were talking about what aspect does this person represent. You know, you can do either invocations or banishings of god forms, and that's something that's traditional within some ceremonial magic, which is for the same thing. Like say you really struggle in relationships, you could invoke Aphrodite to like to merge with your consciousness, and for you to get that kind of download straight from the source of like what relationships and love are about, so that you can understand that aspect of the universe. And it sounds like you were doing something very similar, but on a more intuitive, you know, more intuitively, not from a specific tradition or system.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm kind of have moved to more of a magical approach now, and it feels like spiral really, I perceived it more as like a removal tool. It's more like taking away the blocks and versus like a bringing in of new upgrades and integrations, which it doesn't matter which way you go, like you'll get to the same place. But I now would spend more time dropping in new downloads and new ways of being. But the journey that led me to make the spiral was like, there's just so much shitty conditioning that even doing that is really traumatic and difficult. And yeah, and it's something about, there was an inbuilt pathway, so you didn't need to know what to prescribe for yourself, because that inner structure was already there. So we're just kind of following this spiraling pathway. But yeah, it's the end result is similar. You know, it's a higher level of integration is the end game, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about your relationship with magic as well, because that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different kinds of magic. But you mentioned Enochian magic, for example, and that the system of Enochian magic is essentially to realize enlightenment within one lifetime. You know, and it's kind of funny because you might find somebody who's like the metalhead who likes H.R. Giger, and he's like, I'm going to get into Enochian. Yeah. And then it's like, you know, a few weeks after doing it, he's like, I think everything that I once thought was real is just an illusion. And like, you know, it could like, you could watch his whole life kind of like crumble before him. And he's like, this isn't what I thought it was. But it's cool because I think that the Western esoteric tradition and magic specifically, as it is like magic with a K, is made for the intention of, you could say, building Buddhas, or like people realizing enlightenment within one lifetime, you know? So the kind of Buddhist or Eastern perspective of, we have millions of incarnations that we can go through, and it doesn't matter how long things take, because time is just an illusion anyway. Magic kind of tries to set up the practitioner to be able to take a fast track to these different, you know, states of consciousness, and just kind of like pour some gas on the fire to get things really cooking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess it's a lot like where I guess the tantrics were at in their sort of heyday as well, you know, of like, okay, but if we combine this with this, we can fucking blast through this shit now. And I think it is that kind of hacker ethos that has drawn me to magic since day one. You know, I'm like, okay, yes, I accept these are the conditions that I have been born into. Now let's change them. You know, like, this is how it is, but this is not what I'm prepared to settle for. You know, there's sort of which is a bit in the spiral as well, of like looking at human conditioning and going, well, that's not fair. Like, why is this person predisposed to be amazing at making money and building businesses because they grew up around favorable conditioning, and this person will forever struggle with that unless they learn how to change the codes that are embedded in them, which can be really fucking difficult, you know, like can be really difficult for people. So yeah, magic for me, it is very much, I think of it very much in the kind of Crowley type definition of this idea of, you know, the use of the will to create transformation is really a core part of how I interpret it, and really to do the work of union, you know, of unifying the conscious and the unconscious, or whatever, you know, we can list all the pairs of opposites and stuff, but that's really what magic means to me, is that ability to bring in godhood or bring in oneness with the cosmos at the bigger end of the objective, and at the smaller end to integrate things so that I can live those things better, you know, so to integrate my feminine so my relationships with women are better, to integrate my worth so my relationship with wealth is better. And yeah, I tend to look at it as the conscious use of will to create change is probably the most pure definition, even though there's all the other, you know, all the other ways you can unpack it. That one for me sits really well. And there's something also about it being, you know, a non-authoritarian operating system. You know, it's really about the power is inside the individual, I think is one of the things that has drawn me to it. Like I've really, I'm not like a hardcore scholar, but like I have a fairly thorough dabbling in like comparative religion and you know, those sorts of philosophy and those sorts of things. And I feel like I love all those things, but magic just sits in such a more hands-on, like, fuck it, let's just repattern and do something with this knowledge, rather than just kind of the sage energy, which I guess, like, let's just arrange all this knowledge and think about it. It's like, well, and then what, you know, like, versus like, okay, let's utilize this and crystallize it into power and run that power through the body and change what we are. Like that's exciting, you know, that's the most interesting thing I can think of doing with my life, you know?
Totally. Yeah. And I think comparative religion actually is a big part of magic in general, where, you know, it's like a progression as there's new information that comes to the table. Like when the Order of the Golden Dawn started, it was when Egyptian stuff was really accessible for the first time. So they just like had their heads in the books in the British Library, you know, digesting everything that was available about Egyptology and integrating the Egyptian spiritual systems with like Christianity, with Gnosticism, with Enochian, with all this different stuff. And it's kind of like, yeah, the mentality with magic is kind of like, does it work? Okay, like, let's use that, you know? So it's kind of like, it's free form. There's a lot of creativity involved. It's kind of like if you learn, you know, you can learn basic tricks on a skateboard, but then every single person's going to have their own way of doing, you know, tricks and have their own flow with it. I think magic's kind of a similar thing, where you can learn in a particular system, but the rituals that every single person does or the way in which they operate is going to be individual to the practitioner.
Totally. And, you know, it's interesting for me, like the mentality that helped me build Spiral has come from like hip hop, chaos magic, NLP. Basically, it's like, oh, you can mix and match the things that you need. Like, and probably hip hop got me first. You know, I was like 12 or 13, and it was like, oh, so these guys just take little bits of other songs. That's fucking amazing. They just, you know, they took electricity from street lamps to have parties. That's fucking amazing, you know, and sort of that ethos was just so fucking renegade and amazing to me. And, you know, magic was there, and then when I found chaos magic, I was like, this is the same attitude. Like this is, and I guess it's the 80s to 90s thing of like, you know, you could do an invocation and put, you know, Dr. Spock at one end and Isis at the other and fucking Jerry from Seinfeld here and whatever the fuck you want, you know? It's like, that's amazing. Like it doesn't have to be following, because I'm one of those people who always struggle to stick wholeheartedly to one system. It's like, you know, like even learning like Kung Fu or whatever, it's like, but why do we have to stand like this? How come the kickboxing guys put their foot this way? That's wrong. It's like, but is it wrong or is it just different? And what would happen if I mix this with this? And is it better or is it worse? And, you know, I think the chaos, I mean, even though, you know, obviously anyone who is inventing an era or a genre or a movement was doing that, I feel like the chaos magic era actually package that into the DNA of like, no, you should mix and match. Like you should, you know, like learn stuff, but mix and match basically.
Right. And chaos magic is a good operating system for kind of the 21st century in terms of like the way people approach spirituality, generally speaking, is a kind of chaos magic approach. They're just not aware of it, you know, and a lot of chaos magicians, even Phil Hines, who is like one of the main people involved in chaos magic, he ended up studying Tantra very deeply, you know, or like Peter J. Carroll went into quantum physics and became a scientist. And it's like people study deeply into diverse traditions or techniques. It doesn't necessarily mean like dabbling a little bit, but it's still like taking those core concepts that you integrate from different traditions and like putting them together into something that works for you as the individual, which I think is the best part of it. It's about what works for you as an individual and understanding that everybody's going to be different.
I think of it like MMA, you know, it's like you can mix boxing with wrestling with Muay Thai, but if you're kind of shitty at all three, you're going to get your ass handed to you, you know, but it's like solid wrestling background, pretty good jiu-jitsu, incredible boxing. It's like, okay, that's going to work, you know, and it's kind of like, and I see this because, you know, I've rolled out a modality fairly successfully into the world, and I see a lot of people trying to do that, and I'm like, you don't have a solid foundation in like any of these fucking things. Like that's, you know, because I'm all about the hacking. Like I love the idea of hacking and remixing stuff, but it's like, you should know what those things are, you know? And it was even like growing up in the hip hop scene of like the guys that are deeper in, they kind of know about funk and soul and shit, you know, like they're not funk musicians necessarily, but it's like the deeper they go in, they're going to know what they're pilfering and where it's from and why it works, you know? And I think that's the difference between a new age mess and like a magical or empowering fusion of something that is been adapted to the present, you know, which both of those, you know, there's plenty of examples of both of those in all kinds of places where it's like you mix this with this and you like do you even know what that is? Like you don't even know what that is.
It's true. Yeah, that's something that I think turns me off about kind of new age spirituality in general, is there's like a level of cultural appropriation without context where people just kind of take stuff from different, you know, places and different stuff, but they don't even really know what it's about to begin with. And it's one thing if like you've been, you know, if you've seriously studied Buddhism or something like that, like you spent time in Buddhist countries and you worked with teachers and you really studied it, it's one thing to take that and then to integrate it or to teach it and translate it in such a way that makes sense to Western people. But it's another thing to just kind of like, I like this about Buddhism, and just kind of like take it without really understanding what that is about and why. Yeah, and you know, like Crowley, for example, he studied very deeply a lot of different spiritual traditions. He was like a scholar of so many different forms of spirituality and religion and whatever, and then combined all that stuff together into his own system through his own experimentation of what seemed to work and what didn't. And he wasn't, you know, really what we'd consider a chaos magician, but he did teach supposedly to his students in such a way that was individualized, so that there would be certain people that would be stuck in different places it's just true that not everybody is the same, and everybody's approach to life and spirituality and the pursuit of enlightenment, if you will, is going to be different based on the inclinations of different people, you know, much like some people are very academic, some people are very intellectual, and other people are very kind of intuitive, and those people might be more into like the divinatory arts or whatever. Some people are very embodied, and things like, you know, asana might be really good for them. But there's like, there's a lot of different room to play with in spirituality, and I don't think it is like a one size fits all kind of deal.
No, definitely not. Yeah, I think the Crowley thing, like, as much as and it's funny, like I still find it funny that like people in this day and age have fear or projection on this character that, you know, of course he would have scared the shit out of and disgusted everyone in like the Victorian era, because that seems like that was the point, you know, like, and my wife pulled up his birth chart, you know, she's an astrologer and it goes really deep with archetypal astrology, and pulled up the chart and it's like, oh, this guy had no choice, you know, like this guy was just,
yeah, he's like a triple Scorpio, right?
Yeah, and it's just so full on. It's just like he's just there to like blast through, you know. But I sort of feel like by this day and age, it should be clear how talented and intelligent and hardworking this person was, you know, and like how deep into, like when I read his take on Eastern traditions and stuff, I'm like, fuck, this dude went in, you know. It's not like a lot of the early sort of British aristocracy who dabbled, just they just got what they could and just translated it, and it's like they didn't get it at all, you know. And with him there's this real penetration into what this is really about, and even though there's, you know, a kind of a pompous, mildly racist lens that shows up, which is not really surprising for someone in that era, there's also a deep understanding of what were these people doing in this era, what had they mastered, and also the transitioning of, and how is that going to be difficult for a Western person, which I think is still, you know, there was a deep understanding of like, okay, this is going to be real difficult for a white Anglo whatever person to sit in these postures and actually get anywhere, because they're just not going to be able to do it, you know. And yeah, I think that just that the deep penetration into things is really key. But I don't know why, but it's I'm also thinking about Ken Wilber, you know, and really it's like this on a big picture level, I feel like all these traditions and all these transmissions want to be brought together as well, you know, and they are all ultimately merging, and they always were going to, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like that's actually inevitable as humanity. If we survive long enough to become one thing, then all the things get merged, you know. And I think on the other hand, people can get a little bit caught up in traditions and lineages and trying to preserve everything, when it's like, look, this is just a tech, you know. This is kind of my devil's advocate, that this is just was designed by these people, whoever, you know, whatever culture, to get them somewhere, to hold something in place or to develop them. And it is meant to evolve, you know, like it's not sacrilege to change a practice or to mix something around. Like that's, somebody did that to create these things in the first place, I think. And people get really on the other side of not being respectful enough or overly culturally appropriative. Then there's this other polarity of like, you know, you should not ever, you know, violate a tradition or what. And it's like, well, it's a collection of stuff that somebody took from somewhere else. And if we go back to, you know, whatever it is, 1300, the guy who made this was a total fucking renegade who bastardized the shit before. And, you know, the more information you get, the more you realize like it's, maybe there was just forms of shamanism coming out of the jungle and the desert at some point, and we eventually got to here, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I think that all like systems and stuff, it's kind of like of human invention, you know. That might be heresy to some people, but I think that's generally true, you know. Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up that kind of like aversion towards, or the fear of Crowley, because like I think that if he was just like, he wouldn't even stick out in like Berlin or something nowadays. Like he'd be super boring and tame compared to like most people, you know, like, but the things he's criticized for, like he was bisexual, he used drugs, everybody's bisexual and uses drugs now. It's like, that's not
Yeah.
even weird, but yeah. And I think that it's important to talk about his role in the propagation of Buddhism and Hinduism and yoga and stuff like that, because he was actually one of the first serious proponents of those Eastern systems, you know, and now that's such a widely spread thing. And a lot of people don't realize that even his influence upon the 1960s, with people like the Beatles reading his stuff and being interested in meditation and yoga through him, you know, so he's kind of like a very important piece of that puzzle to understanding where spirituality is as a whole now, based on his endeavors and discoveries and things like that. And I guess, you know, you could say that in a way Ken Wilber is like a similar kind of personality type, like an academic who's really bent on exploring deeply many world different traditions and blending them together and finding their commonalities. You know, I think Crowley had a similar desire to do that.
Yeah, I think that just that desire to synthesize, you know, I think Blavatsky as well, you know, like when I got into her when I was a teenager and found my way to the Theosophical Society, and I've had a mixed relationship with it. It doesn't land for me as organically in my body as like Thelema and Crowley and stuff like that. Seems to just something about me, just my system just likes it. But I have definitely had a long-term fascination and in and out of various things that are derived from theosophy and a love of that as well. But when I read about her, I'm just like, what if, even discounting, you know, a lot of things of getting debunked, or this didn't happen or that didn't happen, but like still a fucking, like an epic badass, like maverick human being, you know.
For
like
sure,
it's just crazy, you know, like.
Yeah, she was awesome, and she's another one that, like Crowley, doesn't really get proper credit for the influence that she had on the world and modern day spirituality. Like almost everything, like she invented New Age culture in a way,
Yeah, right.
you know?
Yeah, 100%.
And she also, her and her partner reintroduced Buddhism and Hinduism to Buddhist and Hindu countries that at the time were under the control of like the British Empire and abandoning their traditions. And she actually went back to India and to like Sri Lanka and these places and said, no, you need to discover the merit of your own cultures and traditions, and supposedly influenced Gandhi and stuff like that. And yeah, it's quite fascinating. And she was, like an epic adventurer, maverick, especially for being a woman at that time. Like women didn't travel. Women especially didn't travel alone. And she like traveled all over the world, like trying all the different spiritual traditions, like spent time in Buddhist monasteries, like went to North and South America, probably did plant medicines. I don't know if that's something she wrote about, but she definitely explored the, you know, shamanic traditions of North and South America. And yeah, she was like a modern day seeker, but like 100 years ago, you know?
Yeah, it's so hardcore. I think maybe just the scary eyes are what kept her safe, you know? She was like,
yeah, she's pretty intense. Her eyes are amazing though. I mean, there's something about those eyes. It's like, oh yeah, she's seen some stuff. Like, like she can pierce into your soul. So you mentioned chaos magic. I'm kind of curious if there's any, like, do you have a specific approach to magic? Are you attracted to kind of like ritual and ceremony and all that kind of like pageantry and drama? Is that something that drives you into it, or is it more the contemplation and the study of it as a kind of intellectual pursuit?
No, I like ritual, and practical ritual has become more and more. I've always done ritual even since I was a kid, but it's become, I think somewhere in the last, let's call it 3-ish or 4-ish years, there became more like, okay, I want to lean into this and get good at this. And also finding more opportunities to do ritual with groups and large groups, which I never had. That was not a thing that I grew up with. It was just like, this is this kooky, weird stuff that I do. My mum's a bit partial and supportive, so that gave this framework of like, okay, it's cool to do this stuff, but it was always a private thing. And then sort of sex magic would be, you know, just with my partner or a lover or something. But then in the last few years, I've found myself in a lot more situations largely through tantra and shamanic tantra and the Ista world and kind of mystery school sort of stuff, and then making friendships with people in those worlds, and then coming together and doing our own ritual. There's been like hundreds and hundreds of rituals in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, and playing with that, like what chaos magic gave me was really stripped down frameworks, of like, cool, like set an intention, create a space, do a thing, let go of it, close the space, change your state. It's like, cool, that's a ritual. That's enough bare DNA. And then depending on what's going on, so like if it's something collaborating with others and taking and leading, facilitating larger groups, like let's say 40, 50, 60, 80 people, which I've had the opportunity to do, then there's more things going on. There's drumming, there's things, there's blindfolding people, there's whatever's required to take a larger group into whatever we're doing. And if it's smaller, there's maybe less paraphernalia required, because if I'm working with myself or my 2 or 3 or 4 of my closest sort of friends that we would do temple stuff with, we're collectively quite good at getting into whatever state. So it's like, so to me, it's not about theatrical stuff for its own sake necessarily, although, when we're turning things into art, that's obviously awesome. But, just changing the vibe, wearing different clothes, maybe using different sounds, all those things like we would definitely use. And I think my measure is just, what's enough to create an altered state, enough to create something powerful to happen, and it's like,
right.
Playing with maybe like sadomasochistic stuff in a ritual, or self-pleasure, or whatever it is, something to change the state, even if it's just breathing patterns, breathing and shaking long enough to get everyone fucking altered, and then dropping in the intention, or then dropping in the main piece. But yeah, I fucking love ritual, and I'm really in an inquiry at the moment of how do I weave that into my life permanently and full time in a way that is organic. And, I feel like we've lost that as a culture, as a West, it's to generalize a westernized culture, like particularly who is not religious, it's like, okay, well, things are starting to drop in. Like we do stuff on the full moon with my kind of friends in my crew. That's kind of happened organically. And we do stuff on the dark moon. And now we're starting to do stuff on solstice and equinoxes. And it's like, okay, we're starting to do ritual plus social gatherings consistently on, that isn't necessarily like a rave or something. It's an actual, it's like a ceremonial gathering. And then it might mix into like social hangs or whatever. And it's like that stuff is becoming, some of the richer aspects of my life, and it's a really nice fusion of art, social, sexual and intimate, spiritual. It's like ticking a lot of boxes together, where it's like, okay, not only am I aligning my own goals and my own purpose, I'm synchronizing with my tribe and with some land and with the time of the year, and often healing and integration is happening, like, to step into something new or powerful. There'll often be a shedding of something. So yeah, long answer to, in short, I really love ritual, and I'm also cynical or wary of like pointless ritual. Like, I don't know if you go to some like new age gathering and someone does like a fucking 30 minutes long invoking of the directions, and it's like, dude, like just fucking I know someone who does that.
Oh, I know.
When they really do it for real, and they just do it like just one, boom, 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 and it's like, fuck, I feel like you just brought something in. And then someone else, their personality is taking over, it's like, oh, really? We're going to dance and sing each one of them. And it's going to go on for like, it's like, just open the fucking container, dude, and I guess I also have the fortune of, I have a few friends now that are quite seasoned ritualists, like, 10, 15, 20, 25 years of, and so amongst that, what I notice is amongst those kind of people, there's a groundedness and a practicalness amongst like making magic happen and getting the job done without too much fuss, you know, like a good ritual is one that comes together well and it works, you know, and it's not always like a big fucking, and then sometimes something spectacular does happen and it's awesome. But sometimes it's like, we did a quiet, cool, powerful thing, and there's a deep satisfaction that something meaningful happened, and it wasn't about some big carry on, you know. It's like, it just, and I'm really particularly loving more free form ritual with groups, small groups of people that know what they're doing, because it's like someone just brings a bit of something, and then this person knows it's their time to do some sound, and it's like, that's becoming one of my pleasures, because it's like, whoa, we all just knew what to do and what not to do, and it happened, and it was like an hour or 90 minutes, and it completed organically, and we all look at each other like, wow, that just fucking happened by itself, you know. Like that's my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, that's the jam, really. I think that when you can get into like a flow with ritual where it can be nice to learn other people's rituals and stuff like that, but if you can do it in such a way that it's really from the heart, you know. And I think that it should be like a sincere expression from your heart, or it, you know, it comes about in an authentic and kind of organic way, rather than it needs to be like this. So you've been doing that stuff in Byron Bay. How have you, is that where you've been doing it?
Here, I mean, I was traveling a lot until obviously I came back here about a year ago. So the 2 years before that, I was between here, New Zealand, a little bit in the States, a little bit went to Israel, Egypt, Germany, you name it. So I was getting around a lot in the last 2 years, and hanging with a few different communities that are playing in and out of those spaces. But also even things like Spiral and some of the Tantra containers I've been teaching in, there's space to create things like that as well, you know? So it's like, I've just been fortunate enough to get into all kinds of different containers in the last few years, where it's like, I started to clock some ritual hours, you know, which I guess, let's say 10 years ago, I just did my own little secret things every now and then, and that was it. And then things have started to open up.
How have you found that people in Byron Bay respond to the kind of work that you're doing? Because I've felt inspired to share a bit of like magic and ceremonial magic and stuff like that here in Ubud, and I've been a little bit hesitant to do that, just out of fear that it won't really be well received by the community. But even yesterday, I had a conversation for a while with a friend that I wouldn't really think is the kind of person that would be into that kind of stuff. And she was like so fascinated and was like, oh my God, like, and I didn't even tell her that I was going to like teach classes in it. And she was just like, can I learn from you? Like, I really want to. So it's like, it seems there might be more of an interest in this than I'm even aware of, you know. So I'm curious how it's been going down there, because I think the culture is pretty similar over there than it is here.
Really similar. And I think there's been a couple of shifts. Like one that's happened here, like I used to live in Byron, and there's a lot of community in Byron, but it was never community that I personally resonated with. And it was a lot more kind of, there's like the permaculture hippies, and there's kind of like the kind of doofy hippies, and a lot of crew that and then there's kind of medicine scene, which I was on the periphery of, but I wasn't really part of. And then I just had a couple of my kind of people, whatever they are. But something's happened in the last year where a large amount of particularly kind of Tantra tribe, and particularly for me, it's Tantra that has the shamanic or the dark parts mixed in. So it's not so much white light, fluffy, new age tantrics. It's people who've been dabbling in all kinds of different stuff. And there seems to be this dark integrated vibe is coming in more and more. So most of the things I've been doing are with that kind of crew, and then whoever comes to that. And so it's really hard to tell, is it just different because certain people have showed up, or is there like a tipping point where things are changing a bit, you know? And I definitely, I think it's a bit of both. Like I think I've held a long standing belief that I can't share this shit with people. This is just too weird or too whatever. And the more that I just tentatively do, the more I'm getting like, hey dude, are you going to teach some chaos magic stuff? Hey, come on. I'm like, oh, like people want this shit. And it's, you know, when I scroll my friends, my kind of Instagram female friends of how many are identifying as tantric witches, and I'm like, oh, like this is not taboo for a lot of people anymore, you know? And so I think I might have had a little bit of preciousness left over that maybe is less necessary than I have believed it to be, you know?
Right. My experience has been the same. I felt kind of like trepidatious and kind of coming out about this stuff in ways that it's interesting because like I've been out about the use of psychedelics for like years.
Yeah.
Never really felt that self-conscious about it. I think because it's more kind of like accepted, but this still feels more taboo within kind of mainstream spiritual culture or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but I found that like the more I kind of like talk about it, the more I come out about it, people are super into it, and a lot of people are really curious about it and want to learn about it and stuff like that. And I got to go here pretty soon, but I kind of thought that like a good way to kind of land this conversation would be, it just seems like now's a good time for people to get into magic, you know, like even chaos magic operating on the fundamental chaos of life, and that's really pronounced right now. And I think that magic is it's very empowering for people, you know. Times when I've been in places that I don't want to be in, I've used magic to get me out of those places in powerful ways. That has really you know, showed me that there's something to this, and it's helped to reduce the suffering in my own life. And I believe that if people learn it, it can really help to improve their lives and reduce suffering and to empower them as well.
Yeah, fully agree. I think it's as good a time as ever, hey?
Absolutely, yeah. In your opinion, if somebody wanted to get into magic and they didn't really know where to start, what would you recommend that they do?
I mean, I'd grab a few books, same as any new subject, and there's some new amazing books. Llewellyn just dropped out a big compendium of ceremonial magic. So if you wanted to get a big overview that is simple but beautiful, there's a new book called Ceremonial Magic, and it's a collection of some of the best magical writers that I've known about for years, but just all gathered together. And it goes through like, you know, medieval era and this era and Wicca and Aleister Crowley and the Kabbalah. And so if you wanted to get a big chunk of like ceremonial magic, that's amazing. One of my favorite chaos magic books is Prime Chaos, which is one of the first things I ever read and I come back to often. And that's really good on just practicals. I love Damien Eccles' book High Magic. That's a really great starting point because it's quite powerful, but also very distilled and clear. That'd be probably my A grade. If someone just wanted a starting book on doing magic, that would be my first go-to.
That's the one I recommend as well, because I think it's like very kind of like digestible and beginner friendly, and it's not like the techniques are watered down, but he just does a really good job of communicating it in a way that's easy to understand.
That's a great place to start. And I think start somewhere like that. Maybe get a tarot deck and start playing with it. And Thoth Tarot is my favorite by far. You know, it's just been, I've had it for 20 years, and I feel like I've just opened it for something's just opened that for me recently, where I'm like, fuck, I get what this is. This is an instruction tool for like a new operating system for reality. Like, oh, like, you know, it's like, it took me 20 years to kind of open it in this way. And yeah, I would say just dabble, you know, just have a play and just go at your own speed and Google shit and get some books and try some stuff. And sigil magic, you know,
light a candle, you know, like say a prayer.
Say some rhymes, you know.
Sigil magic's a great introductory technique also for getting people into doing some magic. I think like an important thing is like, don't be afraid, you know, like it's not gonna hurt you, you know. You're already doing magic, you probably don't realize it. Most people are. It's just like codified or it's called by a different name, and so it's like, don't be afraid to approach this stuff.
It's you and just finding what resonates with people, you know, like you don't have to get into some crazy hardcore weird shit. You can just play and see what happens.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for coming on and having this conversation, man. It's been really awesome to hear your thoughts, and I love nerding out about magic. And if you ever want somebody
to a pleasure,
nerd
man.
out with,
I'm down for it.
Cool, bro. Before we go, like, how can people find you?
Two easiest ways. Follow Dark Wizard Media on Instagram, and I have a podcast too called the Dane Thomas Podcast, and it's kind of like magic, creativity, business are the main sort of themes: entrepreneurial, business, magic, and creativity sort of stuff. They're the best go-tos, you know, on Spotify.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks again, Dane, and we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, I'm done.
The Quarantine Sessions podcast with J. Cole.